Okay, I'll just give it another minute and I think we can move on to the next question. We got some pretty interesting ideas going here. Mean is an interesting one I wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah, I'm surprised that's the biggest one on the page right
I
now.
know, I know. Sustainability, yeah, I can see that.
I like indigenous. I saw that as a word.
Yes. Research, conserving land, better future, oil spills. I never thought of that.
Complex for sure.
Yeah. All right. I think, oh, we have like, okay, we still have a few answers coming in too. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next question, guys. Thank you so much for these answers. We got a lot of answers. Okay, here's the next question. So this is more so just to judge kind of what you know about the gaps between policy and like the actual research on the environment. And then hopefully by the end of the seminar, we can, I guess, take a look and see if your assumptions were correct or not. Okay, I think some of our answers are leveled out. All right, I think we're good to move on. Okay, Sarah.
Hi. And now we would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Pitcher. Among his many other qualifications, he is a member of the Committee of the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada and the Director of the Freshwater Restoration Ecology Centre. He will be speaking on the topic of environmental policy in regards to endangered species.
Great. Well, thank you. First of all, I really appreciate the invitation tonight. Policy is something I've been diving into more in the last, 5 to 10 years, more so than I initially expected. And one thing I'll tell all of you is that it's an incredibly important and emerging field in the environmental space. So, I'm happy to be here tonight. And if we don't have time to answer a lot of questions, I'm happy to take them at a later date by email if you're interested. So I will share my screen if I'm okay to do so. Someone's going to have to let me on. It's currently disabled. It's okay.
You're currently being promoted to co-host. Just give it a minute.
Not a problem. Yeah, I do this all the time for lectures. So I'm here today to tell you a little bit about my role on COSEWIC, and that's the acronym that we use. It's kind of a strange word, but as was mentioned previously, it stands for the Committee on the Status of Endangered. Let me just make this bigger for you. Hold on. So it stands for the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And so I specifically am a member of the Freshwater Fishes SSC, which is essentially the subcommittee. And I'm going to spend just 10 minutes talking to you a little bit about this, and I'll sort of outline what COSEWIC is and then how it intersects with both science and policy. So I hope you enjoy the next few minutes. So first of all, just a little background for those of you that may not be as familiar with COSEWIC. COSEWIC is an independent, the key word there is independent, national body of scientific experts who are responsible holistically to identify and assess wildlife species that are considered to be at risk in Canada. It was established in 1977, which some of you may sound like a long time ago. For me, it's not so long ago. So it's not that old as an agency in general terms. And as you'll see on the bottom, it says it's legally recognized under the federal law, under the Species at Risk Act, we call SARA, and its proclamation in 2003. So it's obviously only about 17, 18 years where that's been the case. And this bottom point, the SARA interaction with COSEWIC, is really where the policy starts interacting with the science. So I'll sort of blend the two topics, both COSEWIC and this concept of SARA, the Species at Risk Act, as we go through. So once again, the important part about COSEWIC is that the members are supposed to be independent. So members don't represent government interests, don't represent government agencies, interest groups, industry, or anybody else. So we're only supposed to do these evaluations of whether or not a species is endangered or threatened or not at risk solely based on scientific evidence and also Aboriginal traditional knowledge. That's what ATK stands for, if you're not familiar with that acronym. So the main point is that on the bottom, it says we ignore social, economic, and political considerations. They come into the game later on, but our committee at COSEWIC specifically ignores those issues. And you'll see how those issues creep back into the policy decisions later on. The structure of COSEWIC is fairly straightforward. There are 10 specialists subcommittee groups, and you can see them listed on the left-hand side. I won't read them all to you. I belong to the freshwater fishes because I'm in the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research, and I'm also the director of the Freshwater Restoration Ecology Center. So it fits my specialty to be in that freshwater fishes, but there's people obviously in all the other groups. In terms of the voting structure for this group at COSEWIC, there are agencies embedded within the process. So we have 4 federal departments. You can see above: Canadian Wildlife Service, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Parks Canada, and the Canadian Museum of Nature. We also have provincial and territorial government agents. We also have co-chairs of the Specialist Committee. We have co-chairs from the Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee. And we have 3 non-government science members. And what that means is we have independent scientists outside of these groups to do sort of an outside view on some of these questions. And these people are appointed over a certain period of time, usually 4 years, and they have a voting right depending on the structure of the committee. Within the bigger picture, each of these species kind of groups, whether it's plants or fish or birds, they have these specialist subcommittees, and they usually have 2 co-chairs appointed by the Minister of Environment Canada. And the current members and the co-chairs select new members to be part of these subcommittees over time using a standard process where invitations are based on expertise. So that sometimes different subcommittees have different needs. Some years they might need someone that's expert in genetics, sometimes need someone in habitat, sometimes it's in climate change, and they'll choose people based on those needs. And once again, on the bottom, it says typically these terms are for 4 years. So we finally get to the guts of what COSEWIC does. So these 3 steps are really what COSEWIC does from start to finish. The first thing COSEWIC does is it creates a selection of database of wildlife that needs some kind of assessment. That is to say, it's usually wildlife we may not have enough information about, so we need to do that. The second step is we compile available data, knowledge, so that can be Aboriginal or otherwise, and of course information, and we pull all this together into a report. And at the end, we do an assessment of the species, whether it's a tree or a bird or a fish or a snake, any kind of animal or a plant, and we do an assessment of that information, and we come up with a designation of the risk level that that species faces across all of Canada. And that results, in brackets, it says underneath, it results in a designation. And see, these designations you may have heard before, but you may not have known they're formal. So these are actually important for the law because of the Species at Risk Act. So species are listed as designations, and they're listed under these categories. You might have heard of some of these. So the top one, number 1 and 2 are not really that often used, but we do have the case where sometimes species go legally extinct. We have some species that go legally extirpated. So that's number 1 and 2. So that means they no longer exist anywhere, either in the world or in Canada. So we're hoping not to have too many listed like that in the future, obviously. And then we have number 3, 4, which is endangered and threatened. And there's a small asterisk beside their name because we use quantitative models and data to essentially establish this. So this is not based on our feelings. This is not based on qualitative assessment. but we have a quantitative criterion that has to be met in order for a species to be considered endangered or threatened, because all of a sudden that designation causes a legal change in status, and then a lot of things happen afterwards. So it's very important that we have a quantification of that. We also have a designation called special concern, not at risk, and data deficient. Data deficient means we don't know enough about it. Data deficient, I won't spend time on it today for brevity, but it's an interesting category because it can become really problematic for some species where we just don't know anything about them and they go extinct before we know it. So it's interesting. All right, so why we're all here today, I think, is to talk really quick about when science and policy collide. And that's sort of what I'm here to talk about for the next couple of minutes. And that is essentially the Species at Risk Act. So this is where policy and the science come together. The Species at Risk Act was passed in June of 2002, proclaimed in 2003, and more automatic prohibitions started coming into effect in 2004. So this is not very old in terms of legal issues. So you can see here, for some reason my screen's stuck. Let me see, there you go. So there's certain prohibitions. I won't read all this to you, but the gist of it is I sort of picked out the more important ones. So the first one is that no person shall kill, harm, harass, capture, or take an individual of a species that's listed under this endangered or threatened or extirpated. Obviously, extirpated is impossible technically, but ones that are endangered or threatened. And the other one is that this is the important one because this is the policy that affects people that are building houses, people that are building streets, people that are building the skyscrapers. This second one is the one that really stops the construction of these things, because you may have a species at risk in those spaces. So you may have a stream nearby, you may have a bird that lives there, or you may have a certain snake that lives there, like we had with the case of the bridge here. And so because of these species, once they become listed as threatened and endangered, you can't harm the habitat. So that's what number 33 is saying. So section 33 means that you can actually stop road construction or house construction or even the bridge construction here in Windsor based on the fact that a species is in the area and its habitat will be destroyed by the actions of whatever you're doing. So what's interesting is this is where science and policy really do collide. So species at risk, are being identified solely through scientific merit by COSEWIC, but then it gets passed on to the government to be dealt with at the legal level. All right, so species assessments are to be reviewed by government and public after 270 days prior to an automatic listing in the Act. So if the government does nothing, and you'll see what I mean in a second, then it'll get listed as threatened or endangered based on COSEWIC's advice. That typically doesn't happen. Typically what happens is that once something is listed, the recovery strategy is prepared within a year, but the government always responds to COSEWIC. So when COSEWIC puts in a designation, the government generally responds, because if they don't, this automatic listing occurs and all sorts of things come into place with no controls. So essentially everything is done. So the government typically restricts this process, and this is where policy and science come into play. So I won't have the time to walk you through this figure very carefully, but what you can see on the right-hand side is sort of a flow. At the very top, as you see, says status assessment by COSEWIC. So all these white boxes are truly independent science-based evaluations with no concern for politics, economics, things like that. And where the gray comes in is where we have policy interaction. So usually government policy people are involved, whether it's federal, provincial. And so we have the COSEWIC assessment, then you see there's a socioeconomic assessment, it goes down through the recovery and then the implementation. And so you can see there's an interaction right there just based on the color pattern between the white, which is the science, and the gray, which is more of the policy end. And once again, keeping it short today, I'll just say that there's a lot of interactions between the two. And so you can't extricate one from the other for most of these things. COSEWIC by itself is the only one where there's no political interaction. So in the end, we'll finish up by talking about essentially the idea that we have to list or not list a particular species. So COSEWIC sends the statuses to the minister that they voted on. And the minister, generally speaking, within 90 days, will essentially say how they'll respond. They could not respond, but they've never not responded. So they always respond within 90 days initially, and they ask for either 24 more months or 36 more months, depending on whether it's a terrestrial listing or an aquatic one. The aquatic ones tend to be more complicated, so that's why it takes longer for them to actually respond. And the minister's options, just to boil it down to 3 options, are very clear. They either list the species under the Species at Risk Act, where it becomes legally binding, or they do not list the species under SARA. and that you have to provide an explanation for that, or they send it back to COSEWIC with more instructions saying that we need more information before we're willing to accept your designation. So those are only 3 things that can happen. So this is a busy diagram. I tell all my students never to do this, but here I am doing it because in the policy world, it's never that simple. So what you can see here is a summary of the entire talk I just gave in one slide, and I won't spend too long on it, but what I will do is give you the quick highlights. So as it says, if you follow on the top left, so this is for aquatic species. So COSEWIC does the assessment. We send it to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. They pass it on to the Minister of the Environment. The Minister of Environment then sends it off to the DFO for more information. So you can see how many government agencies are getting their hands on this in terms of policy. DFO then develops a listing advice. They make 1 of 3 recommendations, which gets sent to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, who then sends it off to their compatriot at the Ministry of Environment. It then goes up on the top right to the Governor and Council, who receives it. And essentially it's then listed or not listed. And if it's not listed, they provide the rationale for their lack of listing, which is typically, if they don't list it, even though COSEWIC says we should, typically it's because of economic impact. They say the cost of doing this is so high that we can't justify this. And their policy people write the policy up based on that. So the last slide is this one here, just to give you an idea. So what we have here is the percentage on the y-axis on your left from 0. Bottom are the different subcategories that COSEWIC deals with, from mammals. So T stands for terrestrial. So mammals that are terrestrial. Then you got marine mammals, which is the M, birds, freshwater fishes, etc., going across the bottom right. And the green says that when COSEWIC sent in the designation to the government, they listed it. So you can see the percentage of times in green. And then in purplish blue, whatever that color is that you see on your screen, it's not listed. So you can see, for example, if you go to the middle of your screen, it says fishes-M, that's marine fishes. You can see that only 35% of the time did they list it, even if COSEWIC said it should be done. And the reason for why that marine fishes is so controversial is because it includes salmon on the west coast of Canada, where salmon is so economically important to people that even though they're endangered, they continue to allow them to fish for them, which of course COSEWIC could tell you is a big problem. So that's essentially how I wanted to give you a quick 10-minute précis on how policy and science interact at COSEWIC and SARA, the Species at Risk Act, and I'd be happy to take any of your questions at this point. So I don't see the chat. Let me just check the chat in case somebody's on the chat. There's the chat. All right, so, and I know there's some questions, some leading questions that you may want to ask, but I'm happy to answer any questions from the audience or from the hosts.
We got one in the chat.
Sure, it says, let me read the chat. So it says, how can everyday citizens get involved with the policy-making process? So there's a couple of answers to that. So the first part is that to be on COSEWIC specifically, you need to be a specialist generally. So that's fine. That can take a fair bit of time, but you can still be involved because people can send in their feedback if they're really interested. Let's say you're really passionate about a particular species of plant or animal. When they do the assessment, it's all on the public registry and you can read it and send in your feedback saying, you know, I think you're missing this, or I really feel strongly that the economic impact is something that we shouldn't worry about. We should list the species. So you can get involved indirectly initially, but as you get more involved, you find out there are some agencies and groups where policy is possible. Another way you can get involved is that ministries like the Department of Fisheries and Oceans have specific policy jobs that many of my students have gone on to do. I shouldn't say many, a few have gone on to do after their undergraduate degree. So there are policy jobs that you can get right out of undergrad. They're becoming more common, partly because of COSEWIC and partly because of the Species at Risk Act. The second chat question says, as you've talked about a lot of governmental levels dealing with specific decisions. Indeed. So one of the downsides or one of the complications of COSEWIC and SARA, the Species at Risk Act, is that it's a federal level. So we're talking about federal listings. And sometimes you end up having jurisdictional fights between the federal listing and a provincial listing, or even sometimes differences in listing. So you might have an endangered species according to the federal level of COSEWIC, but then the province may make it only threatened. So that kind of issue comes up a fair bit. So dealing with governmental jurisdictional issues is something that policymakers in this space deal with all the time. So they need to be able to speak multi-languages. They speak federal language about policy for species at risk, and they speak at the provincial level. And the province of Ontario is particularly difficult because we have the Ministry of Natural Resources and we have the Ministry of Parks and Environment, and they both have a say over species at risk. So it gets incredibly convoluted to deal with. So people that work in policy really have to be sharp on these issues. Next question. So it says, is there no municipal level policy or do provincial governments deal with each region, specific regions? So the answer to that is there's 3 levels. There's the federal. So the federal level generally is either Environment Canada or a Department of Fisheries and Oceans. There's the provincial level, and there's only one other level that I didn't mention today, and that is Parks Canada. Parks Canada controls all listings related to anywhere it's happening in a national park. They have that jurisdiction, which is very specialized, but there's no municipal stakeholder involved in the Species at Risk Act. However, that doesn't mean they can't make input or essentially send in their concerns with regards to species at risk in their particular municipalities, but it is regulated at the provincial and federal level.
Hey, Dr. Pitcher.
Yes, go ahead.
Do you mind if we move on to the next speaker and we put this?
I apologize. I was just answering questions.
Oh, that's okay.
Listen, I appreciate the time and I look forward to hearing the next speaker as well.
Yeah, because we have a Q&A session at the end as well. So yeah, so you can, they have lots of time to ask questions, all right? All right, so we will move on to our next speaker. So thank you very much, Dr. Pitcher, for your insight on policies and impacting endangered species. We would like to introduce our next speaker, which is Professor Patricia Galvao Ferreira, who is the director of the Transnational Environmental Law and Policy Clinic at Windsor Law, among many other accomplishments. Currently, the professor is collaborating with Windsor Law on the Cities and Climate Forum and will be telling us today about local policies regarding climate change. So you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. I mentioned before we started, I'm speaking to you from Brazil. Today, it's a little bit of a stormy day here. So if the internet is a little bit choppy, my apologies in advance. And please give me a signal and let me know in case you can't hear what I'm saying. I received your list of questions, and those are extremely interesting, relevant questions. I made my best to try to make an overview, incorporating as many of the questions as possible. Let me see how good I will be in doing this for 10 minutes. If I'm over the time, I will skip and leave the next issues for the Q&A. So the first issue, we're talking about a different level of regulations. The problem with the climate change is that it's a global problem with local or national also sources. And so that already challenges a lot policy making, because you need, in fact, regulations in all those different levels of governance. So you need international regulation because it's a global problem, but also you need national governments to implement climate laws and policies. But in federal states such as Canada, you also need provincial governments to issue different laws, climate laws and policies, and often they give municipalities a lot of leeway to adopt municipal level climate laws and policies. And in fact, if you look at it, a lot of regulations related to climate change is in fact at the municipal level. And so we have to deal necessarily with all those different levels of policy. So this is the first conundrum. Two of the questions was, what is climate change and what is climate action? I'm going to skip the question of what is climate change, because I'm assuming that all of you kind of already know a little bit at least what is climate change. And so what I'm going to do instead is just, let me see if I can do it now. refer you to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. Those are scientists, not only also social scientists, but also biological science, etc., that gather all the information, the scientific information on climate change, and then they issue this report with a summary for policymakers on the state of scientific evidence on climate change. So we are now in the 6th assessment report that was issued now for the Conference of Parties 26, that will happen in now starting in 31st of October in Glasgow. So it's a very important international meeting on international climate law. Okay, so what I decided to bring to you is a little bit of, when we talk about climate action or climate change, we think, oh, it's a big box, but we have to unpack it, right? So for example, under this big box of climate change and climate action, we have to address different aspects of climate change. One aspect, for example, is mitigation. What does that mean? Means that we need, one action is we need necessarily to scale down greenhouse gas emissions. So you have to reduce emissions, but for example, phasing out coal is one example, but setting targets for electric cars would be another example. But we also need to improve sinks, meaning we can't, right now, we have so much cumulative greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and it takes 100 years. We need also to capture these emissions. So this is also part of climate mitigation. So we need climate laws and policies to incentivize capture of greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore improving sinks. I'll give you examples: reforesting, planting more trees, or geoengineering. I'm sure some of you know, or at least most of you might know, that there is deliberate and large-scale intervention in the Earth's climate system. Some main categories of the climate and geoengineering are solar geoengineering and carbon removal and storage. So all these are in climate mitigation. But then you have a whole different aspect of climate change and climate action, which is climate adaptation. Because we have already been emitting greenhouse gases for such a long time, we don't have time to really stop the impacts of climate change. So we need laws and policies to address climate adaptation. We need right now to already put in place the structures to help us to adapt to the impacts of the climate that we can't avoid anymore. And so that would be, for example, creating new drought-resistant seeds is one example in the law area, agricultural area, creating shoreline protection. Even those adaptation actions will only take us so far. So there is a third aspect of climate action, which is loss and damage. And so even if we put together, and we are not doing in many cases, everything, all policies and all climate action possible to adapt, there will be, now have forest fires, we have flooding, catastrophic events such as hurricanes, etc., that are being exacerbated by climate change. And then what you have to pay for losses and damages caused by those extreme events or slow onset events, they call, for example, sea level rise, etc. We have to also create laws and policies to address those. So, for example, facilitating insurance policies, especially for those that don't have necessarily the means to pay insurance. It's one example of loss and damage, or creating compensation funds, for example, another example of loss and damage action. And finally, there is a fourth aspect of a climate action that is often neglected or treated separately, which is finance. And so right now, we have to change from a lot of investment in carbon intensive or climate unfriendly sectors, technologies, activities towards, we need to shift this finance towards climate friendly action. And so that would mean, for example, taking subsidies from oil and gas industry or sectors and shifting towards renewable energy. It's one example. Asking investment banks pension funds to disclose how they are taking climate risks into account when making decisions on investments is another example of a climate finance. So I hope this gave you an idea of this black box of climate change involving many different aspects, and each of them being very important. So we have many layers. Trevor was talking about it is in the Species at Risk Act context, but in climate, you also have many layers of climate law and policy. So you have international law and policy, and you asked me to say who are the main actors. And the international level, mainly is diplomats, so representatives of governments, they have the voting power. But nowadays, you have civil society representatives. It's called constituents participating very, very actively without vote, but pressing and influencing decision makers in the international negotiations of the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, and other international climate agreements and negotiations. Then you have national laws and policies. So you have the federal government, but you also have MPs that can present a private member's bill, for example. You have cabinets making decisions to implement the different climate acts or statutes that influence climate laws and policies. And finally, you have at the subnational level, you have climate actions and laws and policies in provinces made by provinces, by cities, and municipalities. I wanted to bring you one illustration of how rich the participation of non-state actors or civil society actors is at the international climate negotiations. And so this is from COP22. We are now in COP26, but I found that this was the best one that I found. So each of those constituent groups represent certain social groups. So for example, NGOs, environmental organizations, you see that they are disproportionately represented in international climate negotiations. It's natural. But you also have BINGOs, which are the business and industry NGOs. You have YOUNGOs, which are the youth groups NGOs. You have human and gender. You have trade union NGOs. You have RINGOs. It will be us, students, academics, it's the research, independent NGOs. And so academics tended to go under RINGOs, students, when participating in the negotiations, tended to go with their universities under RINGOs, but also research institutes, independent research institutes as well. Have IPO, the indigenous peoples organizations, farmers, etc. It's just to give an idea that all those constituent groups have a formal representation at the international negotiations. They don't have a vote, but they can present position papers, policy papers, their opinions, and they have opportunities to speak briefly compared to, of course, the diplomats, but they have opportunities to speak. And in the corridors, they prepare and they put together side events, for example, that tend to be extremely influential in shaping the positions of certain governments during negotiations. Of course, they do this work at the national level first. So you have for example, the Canada Action Network, they work a lot with at the national level, MPs, at the provincial level, at national level, legislators, etc. And then they go and represent and participate at the international level as well. Quickly now, the other topic that you asked me to approach is climate justice. Also has many layers. Sorry about that, but as a legal scholar, I have always to unpack things. So you have at the macro level, you have the international angle. So climate justice is about distributing the burdens and the costs of the climate action. And that depends on which countries contributed most and who should pay more of the costs. Which countries are more vulnerable and in fact should receive some support to do climate action. Which countries have more capacity, financial capacity, technological capacity to act first. So all of these influence the design of international laws and policies in the climate arena. Just to give you an illustration, only 10 of the largest emitters are responsible for 2/3 of total global emissions, and that is absolute terms. If you look per capita, it's a little bit different. So it can be more nuanced than that. But this gives you an idea of the asymmetries. And then the impacts are unevenly distributed as well. The Arctic, for example, has experienced higher than average temperature increases, and some areas are more vulnerable to drought than others. Low-lying countries, such as Bangladesh, for example, are extremely more vulnerable than others. Disadvantaged countries and communities within countries are, of course, more vulnerable. And to complicate things, in some cases, some impacts may be positive, so that there can be improved agriculture in some countries that are too cold, including some parts in Canada. So, for example, if you think about the impacts in most parts of Canada, not in the north, and compared to the Maldives, where sea level rise is already threatening extinction of many species, and also threatening freshwater, access to fresh water, provoking coral bleach, and in fact affecting their essential subsistence economic sectors such as fisheries and tourism, etc., you see that they are facing an existential threat that many countries, especially developed countries, are not facing. Another level, so micro level, it's subnational level and social groups. Is the contributions of Alberta are different than the contributions of Saskatchewan or the territory. So you have to also unpack and see in each country which regions or provinces or states are contributing more, which ones are more vulnerable, etc. But then you have also to see the social groups, because often within countries, some social groups contribute more than others, and some social groups, in the case of Canada, Indigenous communities, especially those in the north, are significantly, disproportionately more vulnerable to climate change than the average Canadian in Toronto, for example. So when you think about climate justice, there are all those different levels, and the idea is to have conversations and bring those considerations so that when you're shaping climate laws and policies at the national level, but also at the national level, you have to take these into consideration. Another aspect is who have more say on the design and climate law and policy. And finally, there is a third aspect of climate justice, which is climate litigation as climate justice. So if governments and parliaments fail to act, the question is, can you make them accountable for this lack of action? So can you bring them to courts, for example, and courts, what is the role of courts in bringing this access to justice, climate justice in this perspective as well, of having a remedy when your parliamentarians, government officials are failing you. And so this is a third aspect that I wanted to bring. What time is it? Am I already? So my role next step, can I wrap up? I'm finishing. Okay.
Yeah, you can wrap up.
My role in next steps was another question that you posed to me. So what I do, I study, my area is international climate law. Mainly, I study the obstacles to creating effective international climate laws and policy with a climate justice perspective. And I study how to overcome those obstacles. I will give you one concrete example of the Great Lakes Climate Adaptation Plan. We have an international body, a binational US and Canada body under a treaty that has recommended the creation of a binational climate adaptation plan for the Great Lakes using an ecosystem approach. But US and Canada continue to do climate adaptation at a local level. So municipalities are taking climate adaptation action. Some provinces have some programs, but there is no comprehensive binational adaptation plan. So I'm studying what are the obstacles to going from this decentralized approach to a binational approach, as we are speaking in a about a transboundary ecosystem that is being affected by climate change. So this is one example. Another example is the creation of a loss and damage finance fund to help those countries that contributed the least to the climate problem, but are suffering the most from extreme weather events or sea level rise. It's not fair. It's not just that they are taken out of their own pockets to pay for a loss and damage in climate adaptation, but we don't have international loss and damage fund yet. Another aspect of my work is understanding the obstacles to successful climate litigation in Canada. So I have one international level, but at the national level, I'm working on climate litigation and how to overcome those policies. Right now, we have at the Transnational Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, a climate litigation project that is analyzing novel causes of action to see if we have the first successful climate litigation in Canada. Canada has consistently missed its own targets to reduce emissions, and yet we have not been able to get Canadian courts to even declare that they have a responsibility. Next steps, we have next week is starting the Conference of Parties 26. It's an extremely important conference of parties. Some of you may be hearing about these. Some of the issues, just a little bit of the issues, finance to developing countries will be at stake, the loss and damage fund, carbon markets. So many important things will be at stake in this Conference of Parties. And I think that's it, what you can do, because I didn't have a chance to learn more about the profile of the students here, so which area of the team you are, etc. So I decided to just bring the more specific things that they can do by only individually, be aware of a carbon footprint, make personal everyday decisions to minimize a footprint. And here are a list of a few things: support politicians and organizations doing climate work, being involved in social movements, besides, of course, in your specific corresponding areas, just to be engaged in there are opportunities to participate, for example, when there is a new bill or a reform policy or a climate policy being put in place or proposed. There's always opportunities for the public to present the comments. And it's always good to get together with groups that are working on these if you wanted to get your hands on deck more concretely and more in a more organized way. So I hope, I know that it was a very general overview, and I will be happy to answer more concrete questions in our Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Professor Patricia Galveo Ferreira, for your expertise in environmental policy and climate change. Now we will move on to our Q&A session. There will be 2 breakout rooms. You'll be able to choose between which professor you would want to ask questions to shortly.
The breakout rooms are open, so please join whichever speaker you would like to speak to more about their topic. If anyone's having any trouble accessing the breakout rooms, let me know and I'll assign you to whichever one you would like. James and Roberto, are you good with joining a room or do you need a little bit of help? I'm gonna go jump into Patricia's room then if everyone here is okay.
I'm
Yes,
really happy to answer any of your